The night of June 21st, 1941. While the Soviet leadership in Moscow was paralyzed by fear, one man took a gamble that would save the entire Navy. Without a single order from Stalin, he brought the fleet to full combat readiness. He risked a firing squad to save his sailors. And he was right. He was Nikolai Kuznetsov, the admiral who outpaced time. A man of iron will, legendary victories, and a tragic downfall in the shadows of the Kremlin. He saw further than the horizon. And because of it, he often found himself alone. From a remote fishing village by the White Sea to the highest naval command in Moscow. This is the story of a hero the system could never forgive. Let's walk this path together. Childhood by the White Sea. Nikolai Gerasimovich Kuznetsov was born on July 24, 1904. His birthplace was the small village of Medvedkovo in the Arkhangelsk province, right on the coast of the White Sea. It was a land where the wind soaked your clothes with salt, and winter lasted for 8 months of the year. Life here always depended on the sea. Every child understood from infancy that a storm was not just a natural phenomenon, but a force that could take a life at any moment. His father, Gerasim Nikolaevich, was a peasant by birth but a sailor at heart. He sailed Pomor boats into the White and Barents Seas, trading fish and walrus tusks. Sometimes he brought home curious items that the village had never seen before. They said he could predict a storm by the hue of the sunset. 2 hours before the weather turned, he would already be dragging his boats onto the shore. His mother, Agrafena Ivanovna, was a strong but quiet woman. She managed the house, ran the farm, and raised the children. She could make a hearty meal out of nothing and warm clothes out of old canvas. Kolya's childhood was spent amid the scent of tar and the rhythmic thud of hammers against wooden hulls. He grew up with the unending roar of the surf in his ears. In the summer, he helped his father mend nets and gather dried fish for sale. In the winter, he split logs, hauled water, and looked after his younger brothers. But most importantly, he listened. He listened to the stories of the old men returning from long voyages. They spoke of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, and sometimes of foreign lands reached by merchant ships. There was a small library in their house, only a few books left over from pre-revolutionary times. Among them were Captain Nemo, The Life of Admiral Makarov, and an old atlas of the seas. He read these books until they fell apart. He imagined himself standing on a deck, guiding a ship through a storm and barking out orders. The village mocked him, saying Kolya is staring at his sea maps again and has forgotten the cows. But he only smiled. At the age of 14, Kuznetsov visited Arkhangelsk for the first time. The journey took several days, and every bend in the trail revealed new sights: forests, frozen rivers, and rare hamlets. Arkhangelsk stunned him. The bustling port, the smell of coal, the rows of warehouses, and the low hum of steamers at the piers. For the first time, he saw warships, dark silhouettes with cannons and sailors on the decks. That image was burned into his memory forever. Change arrived soon after. The revolution and the Civil War reached the northern outskirts. Arkhangelsk saw the White Army, foreign interventionists, and the Reds. In Medvedkovo, bread was often scarce, but the sea continued to feed the people. As a teenager, Kuznetsov saw crates with English labels wash up on the shore, remnants from looted warehouses. These finds were major events for the village. The new government brought new opportunities. In the early 1920s, it was announced in Arkhangelsk that any young man from a working or peasant background could enter the Naval Academy. For Kolya, this was the chance of a lifetime. He understood that the path to the sea was no longer a matter of luck or wealth, but of his own hard work. To prepare, he spent his evenings studying mathematics and geography with a former village teacher who had returned from the war. In the spring of 1922, he set off for Arkhangelsk to submit his documents. The selection process was rigorous. Health, literacy, arithmetic, and physical endurance were all tested. Many boys were rejected immediately, but Kuznetsov passed. When he received his enrollment notice, his fellow villagers said he cried for the first time in his life. Not out of sorrow, but out of happiness. His journey to the fleet had begun. He did not yet know that one day he would decide the fate of the entire Soviet Navy during its darkest hours. Course for the fleet. The Arkhangelsk Naval School welcomed Nikolai with harsh reality. There were no concessions for being a peasant's son from a remote village. From day one, every cadet was told that only discipline, knowledge, and readiness to serve mattered. The daily routine was grueling. Wake up at 6 in the morning exercises, breakfast, and assembly. Then came the classes: navigation, gunnery, naval signaling, and seamanship. Every lesson followed a strict schedule. Being even 1 minute late was considered a violation. The first shock for Nikolai was that the studies involved complex nautical charts and logs. He had to quickly master terms he had only seen in books: log, helm, all hands, forecastle, and stem. He wrote everything down in a notebook and memorized it every evening. The cadet uniform consisted of a dark blue jacket, a sailor's cap, and a belt. It had to be kept in perfect condition. A stain on the jacket or a poorly sewn ribbon could result in a reprimand. Kuznetsov once mentioned that during his first winter, he slept in his uniform to save time getting dressed in the morning. His first voyages on a training vessel were a true test. The wind from the White Sea was freezing. The deck was slick with ice, and his hands went numb from the cold. But watch duty lasted for hours. One of his senior comrades told him, "A sailor is someone who is used to enduring cold and fatigue without losing focus." Kuznetsov remembered those words for the rest of his life. The academy was filled with boys from all over the country. There were sons of workers from Leningrad, peasants from the Volga, and former street children from Odessa. The Soviet government was betting on a new crew for the fleet. They took those who were ready to serve without privilege. Sometimes political arguments broke out in the quarters, but the strict regulations quickly restored order. Naval history held a special place in the curriculum. Kuznetsov studied the exploits of Admiral Makarov, the sinking of the Varyag, and the battles of the Russo-Japanese War with great interest. He realized that an officer must know not only how to command a ship, but how those who came before him thought. The instructors taught that in the Navy, there are no small details. One wrong command or a forgotten signal could mean the death of a ship. He learned this lesson personally during one of his first voyages. During a drill, he hesitated for just a second. The senior officer didn't shout. He simply said, "Remember, Kuznetsov, at sea seconds are worth more than gold." Food at the academy was modest: porridge, soup, and bread. Occasionally fish. Meat was served only on holidays. But unlike village life, there was always hot tea and hot food 3 times a day. To Kuznetsov, this seemed like luxury. In his free time, he often went to the port to watch ships being unloaded. He observed the tugboats and the movement of warships. He memorized how sailors handled anchor chains and maneuvered through narrow straits. One portmaster noticed his interest and even let him board a patrol ship to see the bridge. At the end of his second year, the top cadets were offered internships on the combat ships of the Baltic Fleet. For Kuznetsov, this was an event of monumental importance. In Kronstadt, he saw the battleships Marat and October Revolution for the first time. Massive, like fortresses on the water. They were impressive not just for their size, but for their batteries capable of firing dozens of kilometers. During this internship, he kept the logbook, studied the artillery crews, and observed the maneuvers. He saw that the fleet was recovering after the Civil War, but was still far from ideal. There was a lack of experienced officers, and the equipment was worn out. He later said that it was then he realized the future of the fleet depended on decisive reforms. In 1926, he graduated with honors. He had a choice: stay in Arkhangelsk as an instructor or continue his service in combat units. He chose combat. This choice would lead him to far-off Spain in just a few years. There he would have to fight not only the enemy, but his own doubts about what was right. Trials in Spain. The summer of 1936 was the beginning of a new storm for Europe. Civil war broke out in Spain. On one side were the Republicans, defending the legally elected government. On the other were General Franco's rebels, supported by Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union decided to help the Republicans. The aid included weapons, planes, tanks, and crucially, military specialists. Among those who volunteered to go to Spain was Nikolai Kuznetsov. He was a lieutenant commander then, serving in the Baltic with a reputation as a disciplined and brave officer. The trip to Spain was kept in total secrecy. Officially, the sailors were sent on a training mission. In reality, they were to serve in the Republican Navy, train local sailors, and sometimes enter combat themselves. Kuznetsov was tasked with coordinating Soviet advisors on several ships and monitoring weapon deliveries. The first thing that struck him in Spain was the heat and the noise of the ports. Instead of the cold Baltic wind, the air smelled of tar, oranges, and smoke. The port of Alicante was buzzing with life. Ammo crates were being unloaded, T-26 tanks from the USSR were being hoisted down, and a Republican destroyer with holes in its hull sat at the next pier. The Republican ships were worn out. Some were remnants of the old regime, some were trophies. The officer corps was a mix of experienced sailors and yesterday's fishermen or students. Kuznetsov realized he would have to teach them everything, from navigation to gunnery rules. On one of his first voyages, he participated in escorting a cargo ship for the Republicans. At that time, Italian submarines and German ships under false flags dominated the Mediterranean. One voyage nearly ended in tragedy. In the morning mist, the silhouettes of 3 unknown vessels appeared on the horizon. They did not respond to signals. Kuznetsov ordered the guns to be ready and sounded the alarm. In the end, they turned out to be French merchant ships. But the situation showed how dangerous every voyage was. He quickly won the respect of the Spanish sailors, not just for his knowledge, but for his willingness to share all the hardships of service. When a steam engine broke down on one of the destroyers, he worked in the engine room with the mechanics for 3 nights straight until it was fixed. Later, the ship's commander said the Russian captain had saved the vessel from certain destruction. In Spain, Kuznetsov also faced politics. Advisors from various countries worked on the Republican side, and there was a silent struggle for influence among them. Nikolai stayed out of the intrigue, but he understood that politics and war were tightly woven here. In conversations with Soviet diplomats, he stated plainly that the Republican Navy needed fuel, shells, and trained crews, not political rallies. At the end of 1937, he took part in an operation to block the Strait of Gibraltar. It was risky. Franco's ships and Italian subs were active nearby. During one crossing, their convoy was attacked by aircraft. Bombs fell close to the hull, and shrapnel damaged the superstructure. Kuznetsov personally coordinated the anti-aircraft crews and the attack was repelled without loss. During his mission, he conducted dozens of gunnery drills, established a signaling system between ships, and trained scores of young officers. The Spanish remembered him as a strict but fair man. One of them later wrote in his memoirs, "Captain Kuznetsov taught us that discipline is not a whip, but insurance against death." In early 1938, he received orders to return to the USSR. As a parting gift, the commanders of several Republican ships gave him a small nautical compass, so he would always find the right course. He returned home with experience that would soon become decisive in far more terrifying battles. Spain was a school of real war for Kuznetsov. He saw that victory at sea is won not only by ships and guns, but by the decisiveness of the commander. This decisiveness would save the lives of thousands of Soviet sailors in just a few years. The young commissar. In the spring of 1939, whispers began in the hallways of the Naval Commissariat about an unexpected update. The new People's Commissar would not be an old admiral with decades of service. Instead, it was a relatively young officer, barely over 35 years old, Nikolai Kuznetsov. For the fleet, this was a shock. The reason for his appointment was simple. The leadership needed someone energetic, with combat experience, who was not tied to old intrigues. The mission in Spain had shown he could make decisions and was not afraid of responsibility. Furthermore, he knew how to get along with both political leaders and common sailors. Kuznetsov took office at a difficult time. The smell of war was already in the air in Europe. Germany had swallowed Czechoslovakia, and Italy had occupied Albania. The Soviet Navy had to prepare for a possible clash with a powerful enemy. His first task was to bring order to the structure of the fleet. He checked the condition of ships, bases, and arsenals. It turned out that some of the equipment was obsolete, and certain units lacked fuel and ammunition. He demanded immediate modernization measures. He paid special attention to the training of commanding officers. In naval schools, practical training hours were increased. Courses in radio communication, torpedo work, and anti-aircraft defense were introduced. Kuznetsov believed that future commanders must be able to act independently rather than waiting for orders from above for every small detail. He also pushed for the strengthening of northern bases. Realizing that in the event of war, supplies via northern sea routes would be vital, he insisted on building extra warehouses and fortifications in Murmansk and Polyarny. It was remembered that he often inspected ships personally. He might unexpectedly board a destroyer, descend into the engine room, and talk with the sailors. If he saw violations, he demanded immediate correction, but always explained why it was necessary. The sailors valued him because he spoke to them like a human being. At the same time, he knew how to fiercely defend the interests of the Navy before the country's leadership. When a budget proposal cut funding for submarine construction, he said plainly, "If we don't build now, tomorrow will be too late." Those words impressed even Stalin, and the funding was restored. The international situation grew more tense by the day. The pact signed with Germany in August 1939 did not fool him. He understood that war was inevitable and that the fleet must be ready for the first strike. At the end of the year, he conducted massive exercises in the Baltic and Black Seas. Ships practiced repelling surprise attacks, maneuvering under electronic warfare conditions, and interacting with aircraft. These were not parade maneuvers. He demanded realism. In one drill, a destroyer sank a cruiser because the cruiser failed to detect the enemy in time. Kuznetsov ordered this result to be recorded in the report without embellishment. In early 1941, he prepared a document that would later become a legend. It clearly stated that a German attack was possible at any moment. It demanded that the fleet be brought to full combat readiness immediately, without waiting for orders from Moscow. This document would save thousands of lives that summer. At 36, he was no longer just a commander, but a man whose decisions affected the nation's security. But the most terrifying test of his life was ahead. The war that would begin in just a few months. June 1941. The final weeks before the war were anxious. Intelligence reports arrived one after another. They spoke of German troops massing at the Soviet borders. Many in Moscow still hoped it was pressure rather than preparation for an attack. But Kuznetsov did not believe in diplomatic miracles. Starting in early June, he began daily meetings with the fleet commanders. Northern, Baltic, Black Sea, Pacific all received the same instructions. Raise combat readiness. Keep personnel on the ships. Keep ammo and fuel close at hand. On June 19th, he sent a directive that said bluntly, "A surprise strike is possible in the coming days." The document was clear, without diplomatic vagueness. He demanded the fleet be able to respond instantly. On the evening of June 21st, new data reached Moscow. Intelligence reported German divisions moving to the borders. That same night, Kuznetsov made the decision that would save the Navy. Without waiting for approval from above, he ordered all fleets to go to full combat readiness. In the Baltic, ships left the bays and moved to dispersal areas. In the north, destroyers and patrol ships raised steam, preparing to put out to sea. In the Black Sea, submarines took positions at the harbor entrances. At this time, many ground units were still in their barracks. The fleet met the dawn of June 22nd ready. When the Luftwaffe struck Sevastopol, Libova, and Kronstadt at 4 in the morning, the bombs hit empty piers. The ships were already gone. This was the direct result of Kuznetsov's order. In the Baltic, anti-aircraft gunners opened fire almost immediately. Several German bombers were shot down in the very first minutes. In the north, the fleet thwarted an attempted attack on Murmansk. In the Black Sea, the main naval forces were preserved without loss. Kuznetsov remained in his office at the Commissariat, in direct contact with the commanders. He demanded clear reports, but did not interfere with the tactics of commanders on the ground. He understood. Now they had to act on their own, as he had taught them. In the first days of the war, the Navy was the only branch of the armed forces that had not lost significant strength in the opening hours. Yes, there were losses in Libava, Tallinn, and on the approaches to Sevastopol. But the blow the enemy had prepared to be crushing was partially derailed. Stalin later admitted that Kuznetsov's actions were correct. But in those days, there was no praise. There were only orders, demands, and endless reports of battles. Kuznetsov did not allow himself to relax. He understood that the war would be long and hard, and that the fleet must do more than survive. It had to hit the enemy wherever possible. The fleet in the Great Patriotic War. From the first days of the war, the Soviet Navy found itself in a position where it had to do more than just defend. Kuznetsov understood. If the ships stayed at the piers, they would be easy prey. So he demanded that commanders maximize maneuvers, surprise strikes, and coordination with other branches of the military. In the Baltic Fleet, under Vladimir Tribuz, the primary task became the defense of Kronstadt and Leningrad. In July 1941, the Germans began their offensive on the Baltic states. The fleet supported ground troops with artillery fire. The cruiser Kirov and the battleship Marat shelled enemy positions on the approaches to the city. This helped stall the enemy's advance. The evacuation of Tallinn in August 41 holds a special place in history. Kuznetsov insisted the operation be carried out as quickly as possible with all available forces. The fleet managed to evacuate over 100,000 people, soldiers and civilians, along with significant equipment. Yes, there were losses to mines and airstrikes. But without this evacuation, the defense of Leningrad might have collapsed that autumn. In the Black Sea, under Philip Oktyabrski, the fleet actively participated in the defense of Odessa and Sevastopol. From August to October 1941, ships of the Black Sea Fleet supported Odessa, delivering ammo and evacuating the wounded. When the city garrison had to retreat, the fleet took out over 80,000 people. Sevastopol became a symbol of resilience. From December 1941 to July 1942, the Black Sea Fleet held the city. Kuznetsov was in constant contact with command, demanding stronger air defenses, ammo refills, and organized sea supplies. Even when land routes were cut, the ships continued to deliver cargo, breaking through under fire. In the Northern Fleet under Arseny Golovko, the most critical task was securing the Allied convoys. Lend-lease supplies, tanks, planes, weapons, food came through Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. These goods were vital for the front. Kuznetsov knew that a disruption of the convoys would hurt the entire country. He demanded the Northern Fleet escort the transports with every available force. The escort of convoy PQ-17 in the summer of 1942 was especially grueling. At that time, due to the fault of the British Admiralty, which ordered the ships to scatter, most of the vessels were sunk by German U-boats and aircraft. But the Northern Fleet ships still managed to lead some of the transports to safe waters. Kuznetsov took this tragedy personally, but drew lessons for future operations. The submarine fleet played a unique role. In the Baltic and Black Seas, Soviet subs hunted enemy transports. Kuznetsov personally approved mine-laying plans and attacks, demanding strikes where the enemy least expected them. One of the most successful commanders was Alexander Marinesko, who sank the German liner Wilhelm Gustloff in January 1945. Kuznetsov placed great importance on the fleet's interaction with ground forces. In 1944, during the Vyborg-Petrozavodsk operation, Baltic Fleet ships supported the advancing troops with heavy fire, destroying enemy fortifications. In the Black Sea, the Marines took part in landings at Kerch, Novorossiysk, and Feodosia. Even in the hardest years, Kuznetsov pushed for the replenishment of the fleet. Factories in Leningrad, Nikolaev, and Murmansk continued to build torpedo boats, patrol ships, and subs. He believed that war was no excuse to stop the fleet's development. By the end of the war, the Soviet Navy had hundreds of combat operations behind it. It covered fronts, transported troops, and hit the enemy on their supply lines. Kuznetsov was proud that the fleet had not allowed the enemy full dominance at sea in any direction. But new challenges awaited him. Post-war reckoning, reforms, and a struggle for the fleet's future in the already brewing Cold War. The end of the war and new threats. The spring of 1945 brought long-awaited news. The Red Army was taking one city after another. The war in Europe was nearing its end. But for the Soviet Navy, this did not mean they could relax. Kuznetsov understood that another campaign was ahead. The war with Japan. Back in February at the Yalta Conference, the USSR had pledged to enter the war against Japan 3 months after Germany's surrender. This meant the Navy had very little time to prepare. In April, he called a meeting of the fleet commanders. The Northern and Baltic fleets were to remain in their positions, controlling European seas. The main burden fell on the Pacific Fleet and forces being transferred from other theaters. A massive transfer of ships via the northern sea route and the railways began. Special attention was given to Port Arthur and the Far East. After the battles with the Japanese in 1905, these names held special meaning for the fleet. Now, they were to reclaim lost positions. In May, while the victory salutes over Germany thundered in Moscow, Kuznetsov was already working on the operation against Japan. He was interested in the details, from logistics to the weather in the areas of the planned landings. He demanded precise calculations from the staffs and readiness from the commanders to act without delay. In August, when the Manchurian operation began, the fleet secured landings on southern Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. Kuznetsov monitored the actions through direct links, demanding daily reports. He understood that victory had to be swift to prevent the U.S. from increasing its influence in the region. The landing on the Kuril Islands was especially vital. The Japanese resisted stubbornly, but the fleet and the Marines worked in harmony. Within a few days, the islands were under control. This operation was the final combat episode of the Second World War for the Soviet Navy. After Japan's surrender in September 1945, Kuznetsov allowed himself a short vacation for the first time in years. But the rest was brief. The world was already entering a new era, the era of the Cold War. Relations with former allies began to sour almost immediately. The US and UK were increasing their naval presence in the Mediterranean and the Far East. Kuznetsov saw this as a direct threat. He insisted on modernizing the fleet, building new ships, and developing submarine forces. New difficulties awaited him within the country. The post-war economy was exhausted. He had to literally fight for funding for shipbuilding. In one meeting, he said, "A fleet is not a luxury. It is a guarantee that war won't come tomorrow." He also began to develop naval aviation. War experience showed that air dominance was vital for the fleet. New air regiments were formed in Baltiysk, Sevastopol, and Vladivostok. But as his successes grew, so did his enemies. People appeared in political circles who were unhappy with his independence. He was willing to argue even with members of the Politburo if he thought they were wrong about naval matters. Such a stance was dangerous in Stalin's system. The end of the war brought Kuznetsov not only glory, but the shadow of looming political conflicts. He did not yet know that soon he would have to defend not just the fleet, but his own name. Disgrace and investigations. At the end of 1946, clouds began to gather over Nikolai Kuznetsov's career. The war had just ended, but a struggle for influence and control over the security agencies was underway within the elite. The Navy, which had become more independent and powerful under Kuznetsov, irritated certain party officials. The first warning sign was a series of official reviews. Formally, they were meant to analyze the state of the fleet after the war. In reality, they were looking for grounds for accusations. The reports found any violation, no matter how small, delayed ship repairs, fuel supply interruptions, or excessive spending on drills. The so-called Admiral's case was especially painful for him. In late 1946, the military prosecutor began an investigation accusing high-ranking naval officers of negligence and abuse. Kuznetsov was among those targeted. One pretext was an incident in Sevastopol where an ammo depot exploded during loading. Although the investigation found it was caused by local safety violations, reports to the top framed it as a result of poor leadership. In early 1947, he was removed as People's Commissar of the Navy. He was appointed to a less influential role, Deputy Minister of the Armed Forces for Naval Affairs. This was a functional demotion. Kuznetsov realized a targeted campaign had been launched against him. A formal investigation soon followed. He remained calm but firm during the prosecutor's interrogations. He refused to admit guilt for things he hadn't done. He said the fleet's problems were caused by objective post-war difficulties, not negligence. However, in the atmosphere of the Stalin years, such explanations rarely convinced anyone. In March 1948, he was demoted from Admiral of the Fleet to Vice Admiral. For a combat commander, this was a blow comparable to a personal defeat. Despite this, he continued to work. He headed the main naval staff and tried to influence the fleet's development, but without his former powers. Every proposal now went through several levels of approval, and many initiatives were blocked. In those years, he often looked back at the war. He told those close to him that battle was perhaps easier. There, everything was decided by skill and fate, not office intrigue. Nevertheless, he had no intention of resigning voluntarily. His disgrace lasted until 1950, when the political situation changed. The fleet needed an experienced leader again, and Kuznetsov's name returned to the agenda. But the path back to the top was hard, and he knew his enemies in the apparatus had not disappeared. This disgrace was a vital lesson for him. He saw that in the Soviet system, even outstanding merits did not guarantee protection from political strikes. He realized that fighting for the fleet had to happen in the halls of power as much as on the sea. Return and new reforms. In early 1950, Nikolai Kuznetsov's name began to echo in high-level offices once again. The Navy required an experienced leader to guide it through a period of reform and re-equipment. Despite the previous disgrace, Stalin personally approved the decision to reinstate Kuznetsov as Commander-in-Chief of the USSR Navy. The appointment was a surprise, even to him. When he received the order, he said dryly, "Then we shall work." Those words reflected his character. No unnecessary emotion, just full dedication. His first move was to check the fleet's combat readiness. He visited the main bases, Sevastopol, Baltiysk, Vladivostok, Polyarny. He personally went down into engine rooms, went up to the bridges, and checked the weapons. His appearances on ships were always sudden, keeping commanders on their toes. He saw that the technical state of the fleet left much to be desired. Some ships built before the war needed major overhauls. Submarine forces needed modernization, and torpedo weaponry lagged behind world standards. Kuznetsov began a renewal program, which included building new Project 30 destroyers, Project 613 submarines, and the first post-war cruisers. He gave separate attention to the development of naval aviation after the lessons of World War II. War experience showed the fleet was vulnerable without air dominance. New airfields were built along the coasts, and air regiments with bombers and torpedo planes were formed. Kuznetsov actively promoted the idea of creating aircraft carriers as a vital part of a modern ocean-going fleet. He studied the experience of the US and UK, realizing that the future of the fleet lay with ships capable of carrying aircraft. But this idea met with skepticism in political circles. Some of the leadership viewed aircraft carriers as bourgeois luxuries rather than strategic necessities. In 1951, he initiated large-scale exercises across all fleets. A special focus was placed on the interaction between fleets and ground troops. In one episode, the Baltic Fleet performed a practice landing on an unequipped shore in harsh weather, impressing even the skeptics in the general staff. Kuznetsov also began a reform of officer training. He demanded that commanders be able to make decisions on their own, not just execute orders from above. Practical hours were increased in naval academies, and courses on new communication systems, radar, and anti-submarine defense were added. Relations with Stalin remained professional, but lacked the former trust. The leader might support an initiative one day and reject it without explanation the next. Kuznetsov knew his position was still unstable and kept working without getting involved in political games. After Stalin's death in March 1953, the situation changed. A power struggle engulfed the country's top leadership. The temporary leadership, and then Khrushchev, began rearranging personnel. Kuznetsov had to defend the Navy in an environment where priority was given to rocket forces and aviation. Nonetheless, he continued the reforms. Under his lead, the fleet began mastering the first samples of naval missile weaponry. Plans for missile boats and destroyers with guided missiles appeared for the first time. But Khrushchev and his circle had their own vision for the future of the armed forces. And soon, this difference in approach would lead to a new conflict that would permanently change Kuznetsov's fate. The last years and the Novorossiysk Tragedy. After Stalin's death, Nikolai Kuznetsov remained at the head of the fleet. But the atmosphere around him was changing. The new government led by Nikita Khrushchev began to rethink military strategy. The main focus shifted to the development of missile forces and strategic aviation. The Navy gradually moved to the background. Kuznetsov saw the danger in this approach. He believed that in the nuclear age, the Navy remained a key tool for power projection. Ships could deliver missiles to enemy shores, ensure blockades, and control supply lines. But his arguments were increasingly met with cold silence or open irritation in high offices. Sharp arguments began in 1955. Khrushchev announced cuts to shipbuilding programs. Projects for large surface ships, including planned aircraft carriers, were axed. For Kuznetsov, this was a blow. He saw these ships as the future, not as luxury, as Khrushchev called them. At a meeting of the Military Council, Khrushchev harshly accused naval leadership of squandering the people's funds. Kuznetsov replied calmly but firmly, "If we lose our ocean fleet, we lose our identity as a sea power." That phrase spread among the officers, but it only sharpened the tension with the nation's leadership. The final pretext for his removal came from a catastrophic tragedy. On October 29, 1955, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the battleship Novorossiysk, exploded while anchored in Sevastopol Bay. The massive vessel, formerly the Italian battleship Giulio Cesare, sank within hours, taking the lives of over 600 sailors. Although Kuznetsov was not personally involved in the local oversight that night, the tragedy provided his enemies with a lethal political weapon. An official commission was formed, and the blame was directed straight at the top. Reviews, interrogations, and internal investigations began. Party documents increasingly mentioned catastrophic shortcomings in naval management. Kuznetsov realized this was the end. In February 1956, he was summoned to the Kremlin. In a talk with Khrushchev, the leader said plainly that the country needs missiles, not battleships. Kuznetsov countered that the Navy could carry those same missiles. But the short reply was, "You have too much of your own way of looking at things." In early 1956, he was permanently removed as Commander-in-Chief of the USSR Navy. The order included a demotion, again to Vice Admiral. For the naval officers, this was a shock. Many saw it not just as a staffing decision, but as a political hit. After being removed, Kuznetsov was given a role in the Ministry of Defense that was mostly symbolic. He dealt with naval education, academy inspections, and wrote analytical notes. But he no longer had any influence on naval policy. He continued to work with the same stubbornness as before. He gave lectures to cadets, met with veterans, and took part in scientific conferences. During these years, he began writing his memoirs, though he knew he couldn't say everything openly. For many officers, He remained a moral authority. He was invited to the launch of new ships, but he rarely took the podium. He preferred to stay in the shadows. He said that seeing a finished ship at sea was more important than hearing speeches. In private talks, he admitted he mostly regretted the lost chances to create a modern ocean fleet. He believed the country would return to it one day, but he wouldn't live to see it. His final years of service were quiet on the outside, but filled with internal struggle. He continued to stand up for the Navy even when he knew his words would no longer change decisions in the Kremlin. Departure into history. After his removal as Commander-in-Chief, Nikolai Kuznetsov finally entered the office front. His work in the Ministry of Defense focused on naval education and history. Formally, it was a position, but in reality, it was an exile for a man of his stature. He took part in Naval Academy inspections, gave lectures, and met with veterans. In these meetings, he always said the same thing. A fleet is people. Ships without people are just iron. The cadets listened with respect, knowing they stood before a man who had made decisions in a real war that saved thousands of lives. In the late 1950s, he began work on his memoirs. The book was to be more than memories. It was an analysis of the Soviet Navy's growth. However, the censors watched every page. Many evaluations, especially those concerning Khrushchev and the party, had to be softened or removed. Nonetheless, even in that form, his books became a valuable source for historians and sailors. He lived modestly. His Moscow apartment was small, the furnishings without luxury. He liked to work at his desk early in the morning when the house was still quiet. He often went on long walks, preferring silence to noisy events. In the mid-60s, he was invited several times to anniversary celebrations for the Victory. He appeared rarely and briefly, avoiding loud speeches. He said he didn't like ceremonial words, and that memories of the war should be honest, not polished. During those years, he advised young officers and engineers working on new ship designs. Some of those projects later became modern missile cruisers and submarines. Although he no longer officially influenced decisions, his opinion was valued. In his personal life, he remained devoted to his family. He loved spending time with his children and grandchildren, telling them about the sea. But he always emphasized that war was not romance, but hard and cruel work. In January 1974, his health began to decline rapidly. Doctors insisted on treatment, but he refused hospitalization until the end, wanting to stay home. On December 3, 1974, Nikolai Kuznetsov passed away in Moscow. He was 70 years old. He was buried with military honors at the Novorossiysk Cemetery. A monument in the shape of a ship's helm and anchor, symbols of his life, was placed on his grave. Not only naval officers, but common sailors, cadets, and war veterans came to say goodbye. Today, the flagship of the Russian Navy bears his name, the heavy aircraft-carrying cruiser Admiral Kuznetsov. It is a symbol that even in politically difficult times, his service was not forgotten. Historians and sailors agree on one thing. He was a man who knew how to make decisions when hesitation would have cost thousands of lives. His fate stands as an example that even in political storms, one can remain faithful to his cause until the end. The Admiral who saw further than the horizon. The story of Nikolai Kuznetsov is more than the biography of an admiral. It is the journey of a man who could foresee trouble, make decisions without orders, and take responsibility when everyone else was waiting for instructions from above. He saved the Navy in the first hours of the war, but he could not save himself from political storms. The enemy abroad was clear, but the enemy in the halls of power was cunning and unpredictable. He won dozens of battles at sea, but lost the fight against a system that does not like those who act alone. They say the sea does not tolerate the weak. It seems power does not either. Kuznetsov's fate is a reminder that even an admiral can find himself alone on his bridge when the horizon is clouded by intrigue. And yet, his name remains in history. Ships will rust, walls will crumble, but legends live on. And the legend of the admiral who saw further than the horizon will be passed to new generations of sailors as long as the Navy lives. So, viewers, if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. Many more stories like this await us, and missing them would be like failing to notice a storm on the horizon.